Just a few weeks ago, one of my teen daughters was stressing about packing for vacation because she didn't know when her period would start. Ah, the joys of becoming a woman with inconsistent periods. Thank goodness we got KT by Nick's period undies in the nick of time, giving her peace of mind that embarrassment wouldn't ruin her trip. As a middle schooler, she already has enough worry and stress. Those puberty years are a difficult time for so many reasons, but it doesn't help to worry about leaks at school, sleepovers, and sports. Thankfully, KT has completely changed how my daughters feel about their periods. KT period undies look, feel, and wash like normal undies, but they are reusable so she can use them every month. My daughters had so much fun picking from the different colors and styles since these don't scream, "I'm on my period" underwear. I wish I had these when I was a teen. Finally, period protection that keeps up with long school days and everything in between. Check them out. Go to nixteen.com, that's KNIXteen.com, and use code POTC for 15% off. That's KNIXteen.com, code POTC.
In high conflict, you literally lose your peripheral vision, so your field of vision narrows. And that's a good metaphor for the things that you miss, right? And we're seeing it all around us, that eventually you will start to harm the thing you went into the fight to protect. You will start to mimic the behavior of your enemies. And you will miss the opportunities that do arise because you're making so many mistakes. So everyone suffers in that situation to different degrees.
That was Amanda Ripley on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode for our co-host discussion of today's interview.
Today's guest has made a career out of following people through transformations, whether they're surviving disasters, reforming education systems, or escaping the gravitational pull of conflicts that seem impossible to resolve. Amanda Ripley is a New York Times bestselling author whose most recent book, High Conflict, chronicles how good conflict can metastasize into something that consumes everything in its path. What makes Amanda's work particularly compelling is that she's not just observing from the sidelines. As a co-founder of Good Conflict, a media and training company, and as a trained mediator herself, she's in the arena trying to repair our politically polarized culture. Her work shows that the same dynamics that trap divorcing couples also traps feuding neighbors and warring nations in destructive patterns. And more importantly, Amanda has found the way out isn't about choosing love over hate or being nicer to each other. It's about something much more interesting, learning to understand what we still disagree with. I've been a huge fan for a while now of Amanda's book, High Conflict, so I'm beyond excited that she agreed to join me for a conversation on Psychologists Off the Clock. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you, Al. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to tap into your wisdom, and I have to say, this book is terrific. After I read it, I was recommending it to everyone, from couples that I work with to colleagues who are also interested in conflict. And the premise of the book isn't that conflict itself is bad. You make this distinction between good conflict and high conflict. And I'll just quote that you write, good conflict is vital. Life would be much worse without it. It's a lot like fire. We need some heat to survive, to illuminate what we've gotten wrong, and to protect ourselves from predators. But if conflict shifts into high conflict, it can burn down the whole damn house. The distinction matters. So I wonder if you can start us off by explaining that distinction between good conflict and high conflict.
When I started working on the book, I was asking people who had been in really dysfunctional conflict, from political conflict to gang conflict to other kinds of conflict. I was asking them, how did you get out? And very quickly, they sort of schooled me on the fact that I was asking the wrong question. To your point, it's not about getting out of conflict, nor should it be. That they all needed conflict in their life to be pushed, to push others, to challenge themselves, to get stronger. And I like to think about it sort of like stress, right? I mean, every biological organism needs strain to get stronger and perform at its best. That's why you need to exercise, right? But the kind of exercise really matters. Like if I were to just go try to bench press 300 pounds, it's not going to go well, right? And so the same is true with conflict, that the kind of conflict really, really matters. And in particular, there's one very destructive kind of conflict called high conflict, or sometimes called malignant conflict in the research, that really takes on a life of its own. And you end up harming the thing you went into the fight to protect. So it's really diabolical. And so that was very helpful for me to understand the different kinds of conflict and notice some of the signature traits of healthy conflict versus high conflict.
Yeah. So what are some of those signature traits? Like, how do we know if we're moving from that good conflict to some of that more diabolical conflict where we're causing more harm than we are protecting the thing that we're motivated to protect?
I think for me, there are some telltale signs, and the research backs this up, that high conflict is typically characterized by two emotions. And you can see this in fMRI studies and other things. By contempt and disgust. Those are kind of the really blinking red signs that you're in trouble. Contempt and disgust. And, because contempt is different than anger, as you know, right? Anger means you want me to be better. Contempt means you've given up on me. And they do light up different parts of your brain. With contempt, there's not much I can do. And also, humans are very good at sensing contempt in others towards them, even when people think they're hiding it, right? And so that is a threat de facto. And so then you'll respond in kind typically. So it escalates very quickly. So contempt and disgust. But also there are more subtle cues, like when you start splitting the world into good and evil in your head, where you think you can very clearly decide who is good and who is evil. Of course, you're always on the side of good. And then you kind of start lumping people together into categories. Even, if you take 77 million people who voted a certain way at an election, we think we know what's in their hearts. We put them all in one bucket in our head, right? For understandable reasons, but that is typically a sign that you're headed into trouble, because you miss opportunities. You miss the people who don't fit, which is a lot of people.
So you have this, the fancy term is the fundamental attribution error, but you call it the idiot driver reflex, which I think is much more graspable.
Yeah.
But it's this idea that like other people are bad, but like I'm good, but we sort of have blind spots in how we analyze ourselves or people we love. And one thing that your book makes such a good point of is that in high conflict, we tend to get very reductionistic in our thinking. So I want to segue into asking a little bit about what happens when conflict escalates past a certain point. And you write that the conflict itself takes charge. So the original facts fade and the us versus them dynamic takes over. Like we almost lose the forest for the trees. But can you explain that shift, why it happens and how we might know that it's happening?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm glad you brought this up, because I often find it frustrating when we listen to news coverage of recurring controversies or political conflicts. There's all this kind of perseveration trying to figure out why people are doing what they're doing. But very rarely do we acknowledge that the conflict itself is like the invisible hand of what's happening. The conflict itself is powering itself. That's what high conflict does. It's like a perpetual motion machine. And once it gets going, the dynamics become very irresistible. And so if you push, I pull, and on and on and on. And so soon you start to see both sides almost mirroring each other, not to mean they're the same or they're doing the same things, but sometimes they will end up in a sort of race to the bottom.
You know what I was thinking of as an example recently is gerrymandering. I just feel like it's like this classic example of like, well, if I don't do it, they will, and I will lose. And so everybody's doing this thing that everybody agrees is the bad thing to do.
Yes, exactly. And you and I could come up with reasons why gerrymandering is the only choice for California Governor Gavin Newsom or whatever. But that's the seduction of it, right? And that is understandable. And sometimes people do need to do the exact same thing as their opponents in defense. And just know that will not get you out of this trap. The only way out of this trap is to do something quite different and surprising. And you can't always do it, but it is useful to know. And I'm pretty focused in a lot of my work these days on preventing and understanding political violence. And every time there's an act of political violence, right, now the reaction is very predictable. Both sides blame the other, and there's like this whole sort of jockeying for narrative before anyone knows actually what's happened. And I remember interviewing Neelan Parker, who's someone who is just very wise when it comes to political violence. And she runs Common Ground USA, which works on this. And, I was saying, well, which side is to blame? And I was asking her all these usual questions. And she said, those are very understandable questions, and they won't get us out of this, right? Because that's the dynamic we're already in. And so it's so tricky, right? Like it's so tricky to get out of that dynamic. Just, I assume, like in family dynamics, right? It's so tricky.
And what I think is notable is that the same dynamics are at play in these larger group versus group conflicts, as I might see in between two partners who are trapped in a conflict over, child rearing, finances, conflictual divorce. It really is like they're the bad guy that kind of takes precedence, and we lose sight of like the thing that we're fighting about. In therapy, we often talk about it as like the content, the thing we're talking about versus the process. And the process is really powerful and can sort of drive how we talk about various areas of the content. And to me, I think that that's a bit of what you're getting at when you're saying the conflict takes charge. It's that process that just takes over. And it really is driven by this reductionist way that we start to perceive the world.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. And also by old habits, right? I think there's a rut you kind of get into in conflict where you're so sure the other person's heart and their next move that you can predict it. So you kind of skip some steps, which again, to the point about process, is where we get into this diabolical back and forth. One of the things that's exciting to me about studying conflict is that stepping out of that dance actually requires a lot of creativity and risk in a way that I didn't appreciate before I got into this subject. That's where it gets interesting to me, right? Is, okay, how can we not do the intuitive thing here? How can we do something quite surprising?
Yeah, like, can we try something different? I definitely want to talk about how to do that. But before we do, I want to sort of pull out something that you just said, which I think is so fascinating, because inside of conflict, we tend to get very self-righteous and like, I know what you're going to do, and I know what's right, and I know what's wrong. But you argue and you tell some compelling stories that we make more mistakes in high conflict than we do outside of it, even though we feel very, very right. And so I wonder if you can explain this paradox and maybe even tell a little bit of the story of Mark Linus.
Yeah, it's quite a paradox, right? The more certain we are right, the more likely we are to be wrong about many things. Not everything, but many, many things. So I've learned to kind of distrust that righteousness. Not that I never get into it. I definitely do. It's a very satisfying place to visit, like it's really like,
oh, I want to stay there all the time.
Yeah, it feels good to know for sure, especially in a world where so much is unpredictable, right? And that's why, conflict entrepreneurs are so powerful, because they're constantly giving you certainty. They're constantly splitting the world into good and evil. And that's very reassuring. So yeah, Mark Linus is a great example of someone who was very convicted environmental activist in the UK who was quite instrumental in the kind of anti-GMO movement that sort of started in Europe and the UK and swept around the globe and continues to have significant implications. So he was sure that he was right. And on many things, he was right. But then as the years went by and the conflicts got more and more distorted, and he got more and more sure he was right, and things got more and more extreme. So in other words, it became more of a high conflict. And he was, there were crop destruction efforts and throwing pies in people's faces, which he did, and other things like that, sort of more radical efforts to to fight the good fight, there were these sudden moments where he would feel this doubt, this sudden little crack in the foundation. And this happened because he was also at the same time a science journalist. So he was writing these stories for The Guardian and other places. So he had this kind of double life. And it wasn't a secret, but he did have a double life in the sense that he was supposed to be a journalist, quote unquote, and also he was an activist, right? Which can often come into conflict. But then one day he wrote an anti-GMO piece, and in the comments, people were criticizing the science that he was relying on. And he was, very put upon about this and started researching, looking for basically links that he could cite to refute what they had said. And for a variety of reasons that are important, he was finally able to see that actually there weren't any, that actually the research that had become much more meaningful since he started doing his activism, the research didn't show that GMO, genetically modified food, was as dangerous as he was saying, or dangerous at all. And that, in fact, a lot of famine risk had increased because various African leaders and others were refusing to accept GMO food. So it was like this sickening feeling to realize that you might be wrong about something you were so sure you were right about. But he just hadn't allowed that information in because he was really under the spell of high conflict. And to his great credit, he ended up, many things happened, but over time he ended up taking full accountability for this and very publicly apologizing to a large group of farmers at a conference in Oxford, which you can Google and you can find that video. And then over time wrote another book about this awakening that he had been through. And of course, he immediately became persona non grata in his activism movement, which was his people. So it's very, very hard to go through, to shift out of high conflict because it's so lonely, right? To leave that group.
Yeah, often high conflict kind of goes along with group belonging, right? It's like, I'm fighting for this side. I mean, in his case, I thought it was so interesting because he was fighting against Monsanto, who has like a fairly checkered past, but had moved beyond some of the really terrible things that they had done. But he was having a hard time sort of integrating that until, as you tell the story, he, eventually was able to take it in. But I think that so often happens is like we sort of identify like that's the bad guy. These are the good guys. I'm going to affiliate with the good guys, but we lose all the nuance. So there is a cost to introducing complexity. And yet there is a cost to holding the line on seeing things in such stark terms of like good versus evil, where we lose information. And one of the things, and I'm curious if this ever comes up in the work that you do in teaching people how to move away from high conflict, is like this question of how can you begin to see somebody that you like really detest? And the example could be like, if you are a Democrat and you really strongly dislike Donald Trump, could you imagine him doing something that you might say, hey, that was pretty beneficial? Or in the opposite, if you're a Republican, could you imagine saying Joe Biden did something really great? What would that look like and what would that feel like? And when I have these conversations with people who are very strongly politically affiliated, it's so uncomfortable for them. Like the mind wants to shut it down. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think that is maybe a good litmus test of whether you're falling into high conflict in your own head, is to ask yourself, could I imagine agreeing with literally any single thing this person says or does, even as I can also hold the fact that I think they're dangerous, I think they're doing a lot of terrible things, and yes, this one thing they said about drug prices, I agree. But it's sort of a test of the emotional reaction to your point, right? Like, does that feel dangerous, like something you want to push away? And that is often a sign. Now, look, you might decide you want to be in high conflict. Many people do right now, and they much prefer it to any alternative. What I have found is you just want to think about trying to stay in good conflict in your own head, because you will live a fuller, healthier life. That's what I found for me. That's not for everyone, but noticing it is useful. And then you try to actively find those counterexamples. Like, is there anything I can agree with this person on? And it is a problem that can be addressed through repetition. Like, it's sort of like, again, like lifting weights. Like, the more you kind of push out of that dynamic and try like dipping your toe in something else by saying out loud, you know what? I disagree with them on 99% of things, but this one thing, it's a little bit uncomfortable and then it's a little bit freeing, right? Like, it's a strange contradiction. But I think I think the technical term for this is integrative complexity, right? There's not many terms that are less poetic than that, but that is the technical term where you're able to hold a lot of contradiction in your head. And the people I have followed and gotten to meet who have shifted out of high conflict and really stayed in the fight, whatever it is, including Mark Linus, including others, they have a lot of integrative complexity. Like, they are able to hold a lot in their head, and it's exhausting sometimes, and I can't always achieve it. But I do think, we know that in high conflict, you literally lose your peripheral vision. So your field of vision narrows. And that's a good metaphor for the things that you miss, right? And we're seeing it all around us, that eventually you will start to harm the thing you went into the fight to protect. You will start to mimic the behavior of your enemies, and you will miss the opportunities that do arise because you're making so many mistakes. So everyone suffers in that situation to different degrees. And it is useful to see and to find people and vote for people who are able to step out of that dance.
I'm a psychologist, so I'm professionally obligated to notice when I'm rationalizing bad decisions and to help other people do the same. That's just how it is how people end up in bad relationships and bad phone plans. Mint Mobile exists purely to fix the second one. Mint Mobile offers premium wireless plans starting at $15 a month. That's not a typo and not an error. I checked. They have high-speed data, unlimited talk and text, the nation's largest 5G network. All things your current carrier might have, just without the part where they take all your money. There's no contracts, no hassle, no dramatic breakup conversations with a retention specialist. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is for you. You can shop plans at mintmobile.com/POTC. That's mintmobile.com/POTC. Disclaimer, upfront payment of $45 for 3-month 5GB plan required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customer offer for the first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
Running a podcast means that you're wearing a lot of hats and keeping track of a lot of to-do lists. It can be quite overwhelming. We have learned that finding the right tool can be a real game changer. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Heinz to brands just getting started. Tackle all those important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool you need. Everything is in one place, making your life easier and your business operations smoother. And what if I get stuck, you ask? Shopify is always around to share advice with their award-winning 24/7 customer support. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/POTC. Go to shopify.com/POTC. That's shopify.com/POTC.
What you're saying is so powerful insofar as high conflict, as righteous as it seems, is so costly. And this is a quote from your book. We're animated by high conflict and also haunted by it. We want it to end and we want it to continue. And given all the costs, right? And like, there's costs on your nervous system, on your mental health, on your relational life. Why do we want to stay in it?
It's a good question. I was recently interviewing this gentleman named Rich Logis, who has a website that is really interesting and a podcast called Leaving MAGA. Now, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump, I think it's fair to say that there are people who get extremely involved in a candidate, particularly a candidate who often behaves as a conflict entrepreneur, and kind of lose themselves to it, right? So this has happened to Rich, and he has very, I think, bravely written and spoken very publicly about losing himself to political extremism and then realizing it. And he was, very active. He wrote a lot of very partisan things for various blogs and online, and he had a podcast before all this. So he was very embedded in it. And when you read and listen to him, what you notice is how when he was really in it, there was this constant sense of desperation. He describes it almost as panic, this sense of always needed to be on guard, always needing to fight. And he kind of constantly craving the next battle. And he found that once he managed to start to shift out of that, it was extremely lonely at first, but also that he didn't miss. That sense of constant desperate panic. It's a very hard way to live. But to answer your question, why do it then? Why do people do it? Why do they want in and not just out? I think, first of all, when you have a sense of being wronged, somehow you've been screwed over, whether it's true or not, as a psychologist, the stories we tell ourselves are really the only game in town. And so he had various things that had happened to him that, did reflect the ways in which I think our society is kind of rigged. A lot of our institutions are unfair, and the way that the housing market works and other things. So he had a sort of sense that something was not right. He didn't like either political party. He didn't trust either of them, was very cynical about them. And the kind of storyline of MAGA, that he finally had someone to blame. And for him, MAGA was separate from both political parties. It was finally, because he had wanted a third party. He had voted for third party candidates, and none of them, it's very hard to break through in our admittedly rigged system, right? It is owned by two political parties, and that's not right. And so he found this third door, he thought, right? And so there was a sense of finally being seen, finally belonging. He got together a lot in person with people from the MAGA community that he met online. That felt great, right? To have that sense of connection and belonging. His voice seemed to matter because he would write these things that would kind of take off. All of that is very attractive. And then also just knowing you're right. That high that we get from being so certain that we are right and they are wrong, and now we have someone to blame. And it's not amorphous. It's not capitalism. It's clearly there's someone to blame. And there's a lot of hope, ironically, that comes from that, because then you start telling yourself that if we can just get rid of those people or those policies, then things will get better. So I think it is an interesting contradiction where it's energizing and it's also draining at the very same time.
It's so complicated, but there is something almost intoxicating about high conflict, and you see people just kind of return to it as this is what we do. Yeah. Again, sort of, I'm talking from the therapy room perspective, where people get trapped in the same conversations over and over again, and they both feel so right and so compelled to say it more loudly, and then the other person responds more loudly. This is a little bit off topic from specifically conflict between people or groups, but one of the other branches of your work that I really love is your exploration of why media and journalists get trapped in this sort of clickbaity, extreme. And I don't think most journalists are necessarily conflict entrepreneurs, but they need to report in a way that gets eyeballs on.
Yeah.
So a few years ago, you wrote this wonderful piece that we'll link in the show notes about how, despite being a journalist yourself, you found yourself avoiding the news. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, is this the same contradiction that we see in high conflict, where on the one hand, it's draining and depressing. On the other hand, it's so compelling and you can't stop yourself from looking?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think with journalism, it's an industry convention now, right? The same with politics, and there are other industries, the legal profession, right, that are steeped in high conflict. And it's so deep in the stories we tell ourselves about the value we're providing on this planet, that it is even more difficult to see sometimes. I remember talking to an editor at a very well-known national magazine, and he was saying, well, the problem is we just know people too well. we do all this A/B testing of headlines, which is true, yeah. And so we know that if like the more outrage-inducing headline, that's what people will click on. And it really bothered me when he said it. And as usual, I didn't really have the right words to respond to it until like a day later. And I guess, my sort of cheeky response is like, you know what else people will click on? Porn. Like people will click on porn, but you guys don't routinely serve up porn. Like you make a decision that doesn't align with your values as a news organization. But here you're going to just blame the public, right? Like this is the audience. So that's what I mean about the conventions are something that when you're in it, you don't really question fundamentally. And it does serve you to some degree to feed that machine, right? Like people will often accuse journalists of just trying to like make money and, but it's actually even more nefarious. Like I think it's attention that they want and prestige. And the attention and prestige have traditionally gone along with adversarial high conflict journalism. I think for younger journalists that is changing, thankfully, because it certainly has changed for audiences. And oftentimes our institutions are sort of the last to know that the public has left it behind. But 4 out of 10 Americans are actively avoiding contact with the news, sometimes or often, which tells you that there's something going on with the product that needs to be changed. And I think for me, a lot of my time these days at Good Conflict, the company I started with my friend and fellow journalist, Ellen Bianduti-Hofer, a few years ago, most of our time these days is thinking about what's a different kind of sense-making, a different kind of journalism that meets people in a totally different place and helps us make sense of the world, but leaves us with a sense of a fuller picture of what we're seeing that's not as manipulative and not as predictable. We're experimenting, for example, she just did a great short video story about a small town campaign, political campaign, where a group of well-established Republicans reached out to a Democrat to ask him to run for town supervisor, which was totally unexpected, never happens in this town, which is very divided. And the whole thing, she just framed it as a mystery. Like, how did this happen? Right? Like, what is going on here? And, bit by bit, you start to peel back the layers of like, how did this happen? And why did this guy agree to do it? And it's, to me, totally fascinating because it's the opposite of high conflict. Like it breaks that splitting, right? It steps out of the dance and you're trying to figure out as the viewer, what is going on here? And it makes you curious in a way. A story about traditional politics, it's just not that surprising anymore,
I love that. And I love that vantage on media and thinking about like at the end of reading an article, do you feel like you know something different than what you knew going in? And does it leave you feeling curious to know more, or as if you know all there is to know? And red flag, if you get into that mindset of, I already know all the things, that's your brain kind of fooling you, right? That's yes. Probably not accurate. And that is sort of the danger point of you missing good information that might be right in front of you.
Right. Because the reporter themselves, there's a lot they're not telling you and a lot they don't know, So that's a great question that we should think about, having a little survey at the end of our stories where we're like, how did that go for you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you feel like you understand yourself, the other side or the world a little better? Because that maybe is the goal, as opposed to you feeling hopeless, depressed, and afraid.
I mean, it's so interesting because in the therapy room, I was also going to share this quote that I don't remember if you said where it comes from, but I have read this quote in a couple different places, and I think nobody knows who said it, which I think is hilarious. The biggest problem of communication is the illusion that it has taken place, and yes. Nobody knows who said it first.
Nobody knows who said it. You're right. Yeah.
It's so funny. But often when I have a couple in my office and we're working on gathering information that goes beyond what each person thinks they know, because often there is, you call it the understory. It's like, what are you missing? There's often a lot of content that you're missing, a lot of ideas that you're missing because you're so certain. And I often will ask each person, what did you just hear that you hadn't heard before? What's new in what you now understand? And it like gets people. I mean, the first time I ask it, sometimes people aren't sure, but like once they start knowing that I'm going to ask, they start looking for like, what was I missing? And sometimes even before, I'll say, I think you're missing something. Listen for what your partner is saying that you might be missing. So like actually turn your attention to what you don't know. And it's like a shift in how you listen. And it's not one necessarily that we do very naturally, but it's not terribly difficult to shift into. You just have to sort of make that deliberate choice.
Yeah, it's almost like the photo negative of what we normally listen for what we expect. And so it's like, what if you listen for the opposite? I love that. And I think one of the reasons I was so excited to talk with you, Yael, and why I enjoy the work that you put out into the world is because I do think that journalists have got to learn from psychologists. Like we have got to sort of link arms and figure out a way to help each other do this better, because that question is a great example of a question we could be asking ourselves when we're interviewing people, a question we could be asking our audiences, our communities, right? Like, what did you hear that you didn't expect? And then, like, I love how you said, then your clients start to get used to that and expect it. And then they start building the habit of listening. And it just makes life more interesting, if nothing else, right? I mean, I'm imagining for you, you're like, oh my God, are they really going to have this same back and forth that they've had 50 times in my office? Like, it's just boring and unproductive, right? I'm guessing at a certain point.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I will tell people that, you've already had this conversation probably way more times at home, and you've already had it several times in front of me. Let's save your time and your money and do something different.
I'm imagining like a political candidate debate where the moderator says that. Wouldn't that be great?
That would be awesome.
Like, you guys have already had this fight many times, like even on this stage.
The viewers are bored.
Yeah, exactly. But instead, we often tend to do the opposite. We try to incite more. Like, see if we can make it interesting by making people angrier in a debate, right? I mean, one of the darkest moments I've had in thinking about journalism is I was looking at this list of cognitive distortions that lead to depression and anxiety in people. And I was realizing that you could go down that list and check every single one off. And it is something that traditional journalism does. Catastrophizing, predicting the future, magnifying the negative, minimizing the positive, right? Yeah. It was like, check. And I was like, oh man. But that's what makes me think, oh, maybe, psychology and understanding what humans need could help us do better in journalism.
What's so interesting about what you're saying is I've often thought that psychologists could really learn a lot from journalists and how you guys ask questions. I think that psychology and journalism have a lot in common insofar as like we're trying to get deeper, more full understanding to help people in the different ways. But, through questions, through reflection, through really investigating things deeply. And so I think that the therapist can actually learn a lot from journalists in asking probing questions. And I actually once did a Substack that I can post in our notes too, where I asked a few journalists, how do you quickly build empathy with your subjects and how important is it? And the journalists were like, absolutely. Like, you have to build empathy because you want people to feel comfortable opening up to you. And so I think that there is a lot of commonality in the skill sets.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That in both cases, you're engaged in trying to build rapport and relationship, and you're trying to get underneath the thing, ideally, right? Like, I'm curious, when you ask couples that question in the office, like, can you think of an example? Like, what did they say when you said, what did you hear that you didn't expect or you haven't heard before? What comes up?
Yeah, the common example that comes into my mind is the assumption that that person went in is like, my partner doesn't care. And I see all of this evidence proving that they don't care. And it took my support in sort of getting the words pushed across the lines because they weren't hearing it because they were it's confirmation bias, right? They were so convinced, no, you don't care. I can see it. You couldn't prove it otherwise because I have all the evidence I need. And what we got to is they weren't seeing the evidence because they didn't recognize it as evidence.
Yeah. And it's funny because in the short term, the confirmation bias, the assumption, that feels protective. right? Like if you think your partner doesn't care, then it's going to feel safer, right, in the short term and medium term and maybe long term to be like, oh, they don't care. See, they don't care, because it's a protective shield. And I think the same thing happens to answer your earlier question about why high conflict is so enchanting, because it gives us that shield, that facade of safety that, I don't even have to like consider what the other side is saying, because if you do consider it, it kind of makes you a tiny bit vulnerable, right? Like in a couple. Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, in the long term, there's a huge cost to pay, but in the short term, it feels safe.
Yeah. And to that end, you talk a bit in your book about dehumanization. And I think this is something that it's like, so dehumanization is like seeing the other side as like not even having the characteristics that make them a full human. And in high conflict, we're really at risk of doing that. And it's such a terrible thing to dehumanize somebody else. And yet, exactly what you're saying, there's something self-protective. Like I don't have to see their humanity or feel bad for how I treat somebody that I see as less than human. So it's costly and protective, both.
Yeah, right. It's an interesting, even if it's an illusion, it just feels better than feeling scared or, think about how much anger we see in public discourse, but we very rarely talk about the fear that's driving it, right? Like it's, most of our conflicts about immigration, crime, lots of things are about fear, but we don't even mention it.
Yeah, that's so true.
It's been a disturbingly warm, dry winter out here in the American West, which is bad news in terms of fire danger this summer. I don't want to breathe wildfire smoke, so I'm already preparing with an Air Doctor air purifier. It will give me peace of mind and extra protection this wildfire season. Air Doctor's powerful 3-stage filtration captures extremely small particles, about 100 times smaller than what typical air purifiers can remove. It captures airborne contaminants you definitely don't want to be breathing in. Dust, pollen, mold spores, pet dander, wildfire smoke, bacteria, viruses, odors, smoke, ozone, and volatile organic compounds. It's whisper quiet while it's running, not loud like other air filters on the market, and its auto mode feature ensures optimal air 24/7. You'll get reminders to change your filter so you don't need to remember or guess when to do it. Air Doctor won Newsweek's Reader's Choice Award for Best Air Purifier. Head to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code POTC to get up to $300 off today. Air Doctor comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee plus a 3-year warranty, an $84 value free. Get this exclusive podcast-only offer now at airdoctorpro.com, airdoctorpro.com, using promo code POTC.
Did you guys know that 3 out of 4 U.S. homes have toxic chemicals in their tap water? Yikes. Even though contaminated water looks clear, it can put you at risk for a lot of health concerns. Surprisingly, standard fridge and pitcher filters do very little to remove most contaminants, and bottled water contains microplastics. So what's the solution? It's called AquaTrue, the countertop water purifier that's been tested and certified to remove 84 contaminants, including chlorine, lead, forever chemicals, and even microplastics. AquaTrue has been featured in Business Insider, Popular Science, and it was named the best countertop water filter by Good Housekeeping. I have one, and I absolutely love it for my new office. So join 98% of customers like me who say their drinking water is cleaner, safer, and healthier. Head to aquatrue.com now and get 20% off your purifier using promo code POTC. AquaTrue even comes with a 30-day best-tasting water guarantee or your money back. Take the guesswork out of pure, great-tasting water with this exclusive podcast-only offer now at aquatrue.com. That's AQUATRU.com and use promo code POTC.
I wanted to have you talk about the story of Gary the mediator, because I just thought that was such like a perfect story of somebody who helps other people with their conflict, but it doesn't make you immune. Like knowing these things logically does not make you immune from being human.
Sadly.
And I wonder if maybe you could like do a synopsis of that story, but also leave us with like a tip over, given that we're human, but given that high conflict is so costly, what is maybe like your favorite tip for helping to catch ourselves early and get ourselves on a path of good, productive, healthy conflict?
Yeah, Gary is an incredible friend and model for all of us. I mean, so Gary Freeman is a world-renowned conflict expert. He's helped thousands of people through really really difficult, thorny conflicts, from labor disputes to divorces and on and on. And then he's written books about, I mean, he's, the reason I met him is because I was interviewing him for a story. He's a world-renowned expert on negotiation and conflict. And then when he ran for office a few years ago, local office, it took about, as he puts it, 1/8 of a second for him to fall into high conflict himself. This was a local town board position, unpaid, in his community in California. And he really felt like, neighbors had asked him to run because the local politics were getting kind of ugly, mirroring the national politics. And they figured, who better, right, than Gary, who's this, conflict guru. And so he kind of went in with this belief that he could transcend all of this. And what he learned very quickly was that he could not. Our politics is currently designed to generate high conflict. So it's very, very hard to resist, even for someone who knows better. There are 4 kind of reliable tripwires or fire starters that lead you into high conflict. And so one is humiliation. That's probably the most important and underappreciated one. Humiliation, as Nelson Mandela says, there's no one more dangerous than one who's been humiliated, even when you humiliate him rightly. It really tends to escalate conflict and make it very dysfunctional. In his case, he felt, I think, without even maybe being conscious of it all the time, humiliated by the way his opponents in the town and on the board were treating him, because he had kind of come in his mind, as like the savior who could transcend all this nonsense. And when he wanted to do things and he got pushback, it felt sort of like an affront, like a disrespectful. And the other important condition for high conflict is the presence of conflict entrepreneurs, which are people or organizations, companies, social media platforms that exploit and inflame conflict for their own ends. And again, there has never been a better time to be a conflict entrepreneur than right now. It is richly rewarded financially and socially and otherwise. So he did have someone in his circle who was in some ways acting as a conflict entrepreneur and splitting the world for him into good and evil. He kept, referring to himself as like Obama and the other side as like Trump. So he had this sort of grandiose ideas about the conflict and really using outsized language to describe it like a war, right? And those are all signs that you might be headed for trouble. And the other 2 important conditions for high conflict in general, humiliation, conflict entrepreneurs, false binaries, that splitting that I mentioned, where you start splitting the world into 2 camps. And he did that. He had like a nickname for the other camp, and they were the old guard, which was, he now thinks is funny because he was definitely like the oldest person on the board, but he, in his mind, was like fresh and had new ideas because he had not been on the board before. And then corruption. Corruption is an important component where if institutions aren't trusted to do what they're supposed to do, then people will quite naturally take matters into their own hands. Like if the referees aren't trusted, if the institutions aren't trusted, and that's something we're seeing obviously all around us in the US and many countries. So all of these things kind of conspired, and to his great credit, did eventually realize what had happened. And he very bravely just came to terms with the fact that he had lost 2 years of his peace of mind to high conflict, despite everything he knew. And so he began very strategically interrupting it, doing counterintuitive things, changing what he was doing, stepping out of that dance, right? So, for example, he stopped himself from humiliating his opponents, even if he felt humiliated. Like instead of calling someone out in a public meeting, he talked to them privately, right? He took people by surprise. He stopped himself. He caught himself when he started thinking of people as good versus evil. And it was very, very hard. And one of the great challenges of his life, but he did it. And you asked for like a tip or a trick that people can take with them, which I love. One of his tricks was to ask himself these 3 questions, which are before speaking in conflict. When he started to feel that righteousness bubble up, because like a lot of people get into high conflict, he was good with words. Like he could make a compelling argument. He was a trial lawyer, for God's sake, like at some point before all this. So he would ask himself these 3 questions before he spoke, which was, does it need to be said? Does it need to be said by me? And does it need to be said by me right now? And oftentimes in his case, the answer was yes, yes, no, or yes, no, no, or whatever. And there are times where I sometimes use those questions, like my teenage son will leave a whole bunch of dishes around in the living room as he's wont to do. And I'll be like, does it need to be said? Yes. Does it need to be said by me? Yes. Does it need to be said by me right now? Yes, it certainly does. But it is helpful to kind of have that built-in pause and ask yourself these questions.
I love those questions. And I wish I had more time with you, but I do want to just leave the listeners with, this is one of those books that I actually think should be required reading for everybody in a relationship and everybody living in our political climate. It's such a good book. So we will link to it in the show notes. High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. And just thank you so much for coming and meeting with me today. Where can people go to find out more about you and your company and your amazing work?
Yeah, thank you for those kind words, Yael. It's been a real pleasure to be on. I hope we can keep the conversation going. And we love hearing from people. We love hearing your conflict hacks. We have a lot of free resources to share on our website and through our social media channels. So you can go to thegoodconflict.com. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, all the usual places.
Awesome. And we'll definitely link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yael. Good to see you.
Hi, guys. I'm here with Debbie to do the co-host post on this conversation that I had with Amanda Ripley about high conflict. I just want to give the background that I was so excited to have this conversation because I've actually been a fan of her work for a couple of years now. Debbie, as you know, and probably as a lot of listeners know, I'll read a book and just be a little bit obsessed with it for 6 months and talk only about it and recommend it to everybody. But this was one of those books, and I really do highly recommend it. But it really fits into my own writing. I'm currently working on a book about misunderstandings and understanding why misunderstandings happen and why they get so sticky. And high conflict is one of those reasons, right? When we get into a conflictual position that is very sticky, we begin to think in ways that lack nuance, that lose the complexity, that lose the ability to capture more information. And yet, at the same time, we feel increasingly righteous and certain about how well we understand both the conflict and the other person. So there's this paradox that happens inside of conflict that really has a strong bearing on how we understand one another that I think is so important. And so I was just really, really glad to have her on the podcast. But I know that you had a lot of thoughts. So what kind of stuck out for you from this conversation?
I think these conversations are so important right now as we're trying to get to a better place in the world, which has obviously felt really hard and dark and complicated. And there's so much conflict lately. And I think what this conversation really provided to me personally that was like a new and interesting way to think about was a better understanding of what propels it and keeps it going and why it's hard to give it up. Because I had never really thought about that before. I think what it's asking is, what's the function of this for us as individuals? Like, what is it fueling? What's it feeding? And some of these ideas she talks about how righteousness can feel good. It just feels sort of, there's something empowering about it. And I felt that, like, I feel just all fired up about something. But it can also be a protective shield, right? Like, I don't have to understand you. I don't have to try to know where you're coming from because you're a moron or you're a horrible person. And while that can be really compelling, it's also not helpful to get us to a better place. So anyway, I just thought that was a really interesting perspective on things that I think we need to all maybe be aware of if we do want to get to a better place.
Yeah, that strikes me so much at the heart of what keeps conflict going is that it does feel good. I mean, like, of course it feels good. It feels good to be right. I like to be right. You like to be right. And understanding is hard work. And so, I think it does bear this question of, like, if somebody seems quite harmful and that feels true, then why would you do the work to let them into your life and try to understand them? And I think her answer is good. And it's something that I really explore too in my writing, which is that the cost of being stuck in high conflict is both that you lose information. They might have insights that you don't have because nobody can know everything. And they might have a really different view on things. But also it like has a physiological impact. Like we are stressed out if we feel like there are bad people who are just out to get us and are totally irredeemable. And it makes us less good versions of ourselves, right? It makes us more likely to behave in ways that are pretty grotesque if we saw somebody else behaving that way. And we can justify it by saying, well, the other person is so terrible. But if the other person's awfulness causes us to behave in ways that are kind of awful, then, I mean, we need to sort of wonder, is that how we want to be in the world? The other thing I'll just say, too, is that through the work of writing my own book on understanding, I interviewed what I call like these super understanders. These people like Gary Nessner, who I had on the podcast earlier, and we'll link to his episode, and a couple other people, including one detective who got confessions out of a serial killer. And what strikes me about these super understanders is that they're willing and motivated to see people who have done like the most heinous things you can imagine and still are interested in seeing their humanity, in part because they believe strongly and fundamentally that everybody has humanity and deserves dignity and respect, even if they've done awful things, which doesn't mean that they should be off the hook or that we should leave them out in the world. But the second thing is that only when we understand how people ended up behaving so badly or believing what they believe in such awful ways, can we figure out what to do about it? So it is, in a sense, a way of protecting ourselves and our future.
And one other thing that this interview made me think of was an interview I did a while ago with Diana Smith about political divisiveness. And we talked about media. And so it was interesting in light of this conversation, because Amanda is a journalist, it was interesting that you talked about the media and thinking about, where are we putting our attention? Where are we putting our clicks? Because if you're clicking on something, you're supporting it. And I found myself sometimes with social media, certainly I can get pulled into the world of conflict entrepreneurs and rhetoric and divisiveness and political arguments that are not going anywhere. And by engaging with that content, I'm feeding the cycle. Same with the regular news, though, depending what news source you're looking at, but also even like looking at the comments on there. There's divisiveness in the comments. And so one thing I was thinking about is this idea of what fuels it and keeps it going, and how sometimes I can get pulled into that because it fires me up. There's something a little compelling about it, even if I'm so mad and I disagree with the person. You have to be intentional around what you're supporting. And so I notice when I'm in a healthier place with news consumption and social media, I'm just being more deliberate about that. And I'm not taking the bait on that stuff. So I don't know. That's just helpful for me. I think this is going to remind me of why it's important to do that. And why do I feel so icky when I'm spending all my time in that type of content?
Conflict entrepreneurship plays on our human impulses for drama and righteousness. There is a part of our psychology that is drawn to that. And there is a part of our psychology that is drawn to cooperation and collaboration and altruism. And so it's not always easy, but we can choose what to feed, recognizing that the forces that be are, that are profit-driven are going to try to play on our baser impulses. And there is an easy path to just fall into it, or we can make more deliberate choices to kind of nurture the more altruistic collaborative parts.
Yeah.
And I will say that I, too, find myself, it's like a train wreck sometimes, the divisiveness. You're like, whoa, what's happening now? It's compelling drama. But there are really good feeds. And one of my favorite ones that I'll just leave listeners with is buildersmovement.org. And they have an Instagram feed that you can find by just searching builders. And I love them because they show these little clips of people across the political aisle communicating, and they're pretty interesting stories. So they have a little bit of drama, but they're more positive and leave you with a sense of there are ways that we can disagree and still be collaborators. We don't have to be Pollyanna-ish about it. We can sort of recognize that we have different philosophies, different value sets, and we can still treat each other as humans with respect rather than fall into this terrible, divisive, harmful conflict. So if any listeners out there are moved by this conversation that I had with Amanda, or have stories to share about how you've exited high conflict and how that worked, I would love to hear from you. You can message us at our email, offtheclockpsych@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, but we hope that you enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclockpsych.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.